final part of theme 2, we're going to talk about different research techniques. Remember we said that there were things like experiments, surveys, interviews, literature reviews, case studies, action research. These are all research methods or research techniques. They are not necessarily research methodologies. What do we mean with an experimental research technique? As an experiment is a very methodological procedure that we do with a particular goal, and that is to verify, to falsify, or to establish the accuracy of a hypothesis. And it involves the deliberate manipulation of an intervention in order to determine its effects. In other words, we have a condition that we set up, and we then manipulate that particular condition with an intervention. We do something to it so that we can see what is the effect of that intervention. And in experiments, we will use constant, so it's dependent, and changing independent variables. So there's something that always stays the same, and there is something that we keep on changing, which is the independent variables. The main question we want to answer with an experiment is what will happen if? When we do surveys, we collect information from a large number of cases. And we usually do this with a questionnaire. And you get different types of surveys. You get a cross-sectional survey, which is data that we collect at one time across a number of sections, or you get longitudinal types, which we collect data over a particular period. So you would do every 3 or every 5 years, you would administer the same questionnaire to the same people or to the same kinds of people. Then we use our data to and we collect the data usually in the form of numbers, and we can then analyze that using quantitative techniques. And the reason we are using such large numbers and we use quantitative techniques or statistical techniques is because generalizability is very important. So we want to be able to generalize our findings to the larger population. So we will take a sample of the population, administer our questionnaire, see what the answers are, analyze our findings, and then if our sample is a representative sample, we can then generalize that to the overall population with the idea that these findings would then be applicable to the entire population of that particular group. And we'll talk about sample sizes and so on later on in the course. But when we have a survey as a technique, it's very important to say how your samples were chosen, what the response rates were, and what the validity and the reliability of your instruments are. The third technique is interviews. That's where we deal with individuals, or we can have small, which we call focus groups. And you get 3 types of interviews: a structured interview, a semi-structured, and an unstructured interview. A structured interview is where you have a design question, you have a questionnaire that you've designed previously, and you sit with your individual and you go with them through the questionnaire. If you have a semi-structured interview, you would have an interview schedule, not necessarily a questionnaire. And an interview schedule basically just says, this is the kind of questions that I want to ask. The important part is that you stick to this for all the people that you interview. So you ask all the people exactly the same questions. With a semi-structured interview, you will have a list of questions, but you will allow some room for exploration. So you can say, you keep discussing something and your interviewee brings up other points, you can pursue those points. It's not like with a questionnaire where you have to bring them back to the questions that it is that you want to answer. And an unstructured interview is where you discuss a general theme and you say, let's talk about this. And unstructured interviews works usually quite well when you have focus groups. The fourth type of technique that you can use is a literature review. Now, all studies have a literature review, but you can also have a literature review as your entire research study. And the idea of a literature review is that you summarize and comment on that what is already known about a particular topic. So you talk about the general findings, where people are supporting each other, where there are controversies in the field. and where you can get a synthesis from what everybody else has said. And that's the point of a literature review, is it can create new knowledge by synthesizing your information and by critically analyzing it so that we can get new perspectives on a problem. There are also ways of doing a systematic review, so you ensure that all your relevant sources have been included, whether they've been published or not. You make a quantitative synthesis of the results of all the studies, for example, by meta-analysis. So meta-analysis, you can use this a number of software that one uses for meta-analysis that may look at all the incidences of a particular term that has been in the literature and how often that term arises through the literature. When you can't do a systematic review, in other words, you don't have large samples of literature that you run through that kind of software, and we often find that in situations where your field is fairly new or where the findings in the field is qualitative. So you can't look at the quantitative findings of all your studies and analyze that in a structured and a systematic way, but you're dealing with qualitative data. And here a review will help you to understand what the key concepts are, or what the critical or the alternative perspectives in a field is. And to do this kind of literature study, we will use grounded theory or reflective equilibrium techniques. Another type of technique that we can use is the philosophical or the discursive thing, where we basically argue something. So you draw on existing literature, not on empirical data that is new. And you have a discursive study where you examine a particular issue from an alternative perspective. For example, feminism. An example of a study like this is the area of ecological feminism, where researchers are looking at the parallels between the oppression of females and the oppression of the earth. And a discursive study puts forward a particular argument, and you want to convince your audience that your argument is correct. Or you can actually examine a particular methodological issue in terms of the methods that has been used to study a particular phenomenon. Case study is where we collect empirical data, but we do this from one or a small number of cases, and we have rich detail about those cases. So in case study research, it is normally a qualitative research that we are doing, although it is possible to do mixed methods when you're doing case studies. And the purpose of a case study is it provides us insight into a particular situation and the experiences and the interpretations of those involved in that particular situation. And it does not claim to represent all people in that particular situation. So you should be very careful not to overgeneralize the findings from a case study. What is useful about a case study is it gives us new understandings, it gives us new explanations for particular phenomena, and we can use those to then formulate hypotheses that can be tested in a general population. And we have very different approaches to case study work. For example, ethnographic or ethogenic case studies. And you have to be very clear in which tradition you're working, because each of them have particular rules for how you look at the data, how you collect your data, and how you report on that particular data. Then we get participant observation, which is basically what it said, is your researcher is embedded in the context. It is a participant of that which it is observing. So your researcher takes part in the daily activities of the group that is being studied, and he or she experiences what group members experience and then records those observations and experiences, and very importantly, reflect on their personal experience. The last method of research that we're going to talk about is participatory action research, or simple action research. And here we have the participants, the people that we are researching are involved in the planning and the implementation of the research outcomes. And this is the kind of research that's often done with governments or NGOs, where the researcher is working with the body to do the research. And the purpose of action research is to bring about change. So what comes up after this is our third theme, which is preparing a research proposal, and I'll see you all in class for this. Thank you very much.